It's a blessing to be with you here on this Thursday, and today we're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 1. The book of 2 Corinthians is a great blessing to me because it reveals the very heart of the Apostle Paul. I studied this early on in my ministry and was touched by the humanness of the Apostle Paul, and yet all that God did through him. He had poured his life into this church, been there for well over a year, and that was unusual for him to spend that much time. He wrote the book of 1 Corinthians that confronted the issues within the church. Many believe he wrote another epistle, and then this second epistle, in which he gets right down to the heart issues and really wants to see this church go forward. And in doing that, he gives his own testimony. And in chapter 1, verse 8, he talks about they were pressed without measure. They were despairing even of life when they were in Asia there. And then he says in verse 9, but we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raiseth the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. Paul was obviously going through a number of different difficult situations. He had been stoned and left for dead. He had been imprisoned. He had been shipwrecked 3 times, according to other passages. He had gone through many dangers, had been betrayed by his own helpers, a very difficult set of circumstances. And yet he says, in all of this, we learn not to trust in ourselves. You know, one of the greatest things about trials is that we see we got to have God. Our problem is we think we got it. You know, we got this. We're going to be okay. And we can live this part of our life without walking in the Spirit. But the only problem is when you do that, you are sowing seeds of corruption, Galatians chapter 6, and you're going to reap a harvest of corruption. And so God has to continually remind us we need him in the everyday decisions of life, in the efforts that we make, and obviously in the great trials and major decisions that we face in our lives. And here he said, God who raised up the dead is the one that we should trust, and he did deliver us and is delivering us. There's much that's probably involved in these verses and what he's talking about in his life, but he gets across to them that he trusted God to do for him what he could not do. And friend, I just want to encourage you today. Maybe some of the pressures you're facing is that you're just trying to handle life yourself. And or it may be you're facing a real trial. Well, rejoice in that trial. You're finding out I need God. That's our biggest problem. When we don't think we need him, that's our greatest danger, and that is the weakest part of our lives. And so let's learn that we cannot do anything without him, that we don't want to live a moment without him. We've got to have that simple trust in him. And the Apostle Paul looked at all the trials he went through as a constant reminder of his need for the Lord, and that God will always deliver if we trust him.